Good evening. In advance of the meeting, we would like to draw your attention to some of the features of this platform. The main navigation is located to the left-hand side of your screen. Here you will find the programme, live stream, speaker biographies, attendee profiles, and much more. The attendee engagement platform is to the right of your screen. Here you can submit questions for the speaker, upvote or like questions that have already been submitted, submit your feedback, and make notes on each session and then email them to yourself. The live stream can be enlarged or you can pop it out. The meeting is about to begin. We hope you enjoy the event.
Welcome to the EPA Climate Action Lecture Online as part of the EPA Climate Change Lecture Series. We've been with one another before in the round room in the Mansion House over the past decade and more. And we also welcome newcomers now to this audience being online. It's available to viewers to join us from anywhere in the world. And we've had 600 registered to view tonight's lecture. My name is John Bowman. My pleasure to be your chairperson. On the screen beside me, you will see an overview of the format for the evening. We'll begin with an opening address by our Director General of the EPA, Laura Burke. Our lecture this evening is entitled, Direct the Money, How Does Finance Become an Enabler of a Climate-Neutral Economy and Society? And the lecture will be given by Dr Kirsten Dunlop, who's CEO of the European Institution of Innovation and Technology's Climate-KIC. That's Knowledge Innovation Community, Climate-KIC. Good evening, Kirsten, joining us from the Netherlands. You're very welcome to this evening's
Good evening,
lecture.
John.
Good evening. And that's quite a big title, isn't it? The EIT Climate-KIC. So can you just break that down for us?
The European Institute of Innovation and Technology is the founder of Climate-KIC, and our core funder has been our core funder for 12 years. It's one of Europe's key instruments for supporting entrepreneurship, education, and innovation, with a particular focus on growth, prosperity, jobs in the European market. And so we are proud to be part of the family of knowledge innovation communities, in our case, specifically focused on climate action.
Thank you very much for that. And Kirsten's background is in banking. She'll talk about the relationship between finance and climate change and the challenge of transforming our world over the next decade to halt the increase of carbon emissions. Kirsten's lecture will be followed by a questions and answers session. You can use this online platform to submit your questions. You'll find the submit a question to the right of the main live stream. Questions are anonymous, but you can also give your name and organization and keep them short and concise. And if you're posting on social media, please use the hashtag Climate Lecture 2021. I now call upon Laura Burke, Director General of the Environmental Protection Agency, to open this evening's conference.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you are very welcome to the first EPA Climate Change Lecture of 2021. My name is Laura Burke, and I am the Director General of the Environmental Protection Agency. Firstly, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr Kirsten Dunlop, to provide what promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking lecture tonight on Direct the Money, How Does Finance Become an Enabler of a Climate-Neutral Economy and Society? And of course, just to mention that this climate change lecture series is part of the Government of Ireland's National Dialogue on Climate Action. For those of you with longer memories, the EPA lecture series does predate the dialogue, but provides an important foundation for the dialogue process. In the past, we've had these lectures in the beautiful surrounds of Dublin's Mansion House. However, due to COVID-19 and the associated restrictions, we went online for our second lecture in 2020. And this proved to be such a great success that we're really happy to continue this format for this lecture this evening. We are also very honoured to have the continued support of Dr. John Bowman to moderate and chair this evening's session. And for those of you who've attended these lectures previously, I'm sure you will agree that it wouldn't be a climate change lecture without John chairing and guiding us through this evening's process. But firstly, just a couple of words on the EPA. We have many roles in relation to climate change, including the provision of greenhouse gas inventories and projections, national implementation of the EU emissions trading scheme in Ireland, coordination and support for climate change research, secretariat to the Climate Change Advisory Council and the National Dialogue Process, and most recently, the management of Ireland's climate information platform, Climate Ireland. These roles are central to informing and advancing climate actions in Ireland. And the EPA also works with EU and UN partners on climate change, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The next decade needs to be one of major developments and advances in relation to Ireland's response to climate change. Full and early implementation of ambitious policies and measures can deliver Ireland's current and future commitments to be a climate neutral economy and a climate resilient society by 2050. However, EPA greenhouse gas projections show the difficulties that Ireland faces in achieving even our current obligation of a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. In January, the EPA and the SCAI published an assessment of the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions for 2020. These estimate a 6% reduction in emissions relative to 2019. And really, this is largely due to the dramatic changes in our economy and how we lived, worked, and travelled during 2020 as a result of COVID-19 restrictions. And it's believed that the economic rebound from the pandemic, it is estimated to bring emissions back to previous levels unless additional action is taken. And this further underlines the scale of the challenge that we have ahead of us. Short-term emission reductions due to COVID-19 do not negate the need for long-term, sustained action across all sectors for Ireland to play its part in keeping the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Focusing on climate action as part of a green recovery offers the opportunity to rebuild our economy, generate new jobs, and respond to climate change. So really a win-win situation. A key enabler of the green recovery is the role of international finance, which is central to driving change at the speed and scale needed while rebuilding economic and social systems that are fit for purpose. Public and private finance are both a necessary support and a catalyst for climate action as we move away from our reliance on fossil fuels for energy, transport, and heat. Public investment must provide leadership across all sectors and can encourage and leverage further investment from private sources in the technologies and the infrastructure that will support lower greenhouse gas emissions. So we're delighted that Dr. Dunlop's presentation here tonight will provide us some insights on the relationship between climate change and finance, the role of finance in enabling a climate neutral economy and society, and the opportunities for public and private finance in Ireland under the shift in investment in climate neutrality and resilience. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's lecture, and I'm sure you all are. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John Bowman to guide us through and share the rest of this evening's proceedings. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Laura, very much for that welcome address. The lecture and questions and answer session, I should say, are being recorded. All will be available on EPA Ireland website and on EPA Ireland YouTube channel, and may be used by the EPA for future communications. There's also a feedback survey this evening, so please let us know what you think of proceedings. Laura has already introduced aspects of Dr. Dunlop's expertise. I now invite Dr. Kirsten Dunlop to join us online for her lecture in this 2021 season. Kirsten.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you, Laura. Thank you to the EPA and to JPI Climate for the invitation to give this EPA Climate Lecture series, this lecture this evening. As Laura said, I am here to talk about the relationship between finance and climate change, something that I consider to be one of the most pressing topics of our times for the future of Ireland, also one of the most strategically relevant topics given the role that Ireland might play on the global change. I will be talking about the role that finance needs to play in transforming our world in the next 10 years. And that includes halting the rise of carbon emissions, beginning the slow process of reversing global warming, helping us to live with the consequences of the climate change effects we have already triggered, and ultimately setting the parameters for us to live differently in this world. And I am appealing to you as representatives of one of the global financial centres here in Dublin. So as John said, I lead an organisation called EIT Climate-KIC, a complex name, which is the EU's largest agency focused on climate innovation and funded by the European Institute of Innovation Technology and a number of other impact-focused funders, including, I'm proud to say, Irish Aid. We support business creation, education and innovation in policy, in technology and in social change, all in service of tackling climate change, including both decarbonisation, so reducing carbon emissions on the one hand, and human impact on natural systems, and on the other, adaptation and resilience to climate change effects. Our activities are principally directed at innovation to address hard to abate emissions. So in some of the most difficult sectors that exist, like agriculture or food production, forestry, core materials like steel and plastic, ports, shipping, aviation. But we also have quite a component of our work in innovation of the financial system and the financial service industry, including core finance, risk and insurance. And we have a broad scope of our activities because our mission and our vision is focused on innovation to achieve systemic change. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. We work across the full EU, all EU member states. We also have projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South America and Southeast Asia, and partnerships in Israel and on the west coast of the US, in China and in Australia. So we're European, we have quite a broad global footprint, and we are very proud to be a partner, a long-term partner of Sustainable Nation Ireland, now Sustainable Finest Ireland, financing Irish climate entrepreneurship together with Trinity College Dublin, sustainable fintech solutions, supporting the leadership that Ireland has shown from the outset in accelerating the growth of the UNEP-supported Financial Centres for Sustainability that Stephen Nolan now directs. And our work has supported the development of Ireland for Finance, the government strategy for the development of Ireland's international financial sector service to 2025, which means that I have also had the pleasure, before our world shifted on its pandemic axis, to be in Dublin for the Climate Finance Innovation Summit in 2019, and we do continue to support the Irish Climate Finance Weeks. So that's where I'm speaking from. I'm here as the leader of a practitioner organisation in the business of catalysing whole systems transformation through innovation, and with a history of engagement in the financial service system, in financial innovation, and in the transformation of financial services to be part of the solution rather than at the heart of the problem. So let me come then to the topic at hand. How does finance become an enabler of a climate neutral economy and society? And what are the opportunities for Ireland in that against this kind of backdrop? I know you are here because you are concerned about climate and likely well informed as to the scale of the challenge we have on our hands and the urgency of addressing it. But I do think it's important to take stock together for a moment on what the financial system needs to become an enabler of, so that you know why I'm going to be making the arguments that I'm making. We live in a time of climate emergency. Emergency means, and I'm going to quote David Attenborough, we face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies. Essentially, we have been relying on models for global warming that are too conservative, and our commitments to action globally are still desperately inadequate. Global warming and global warming feedback effects, particularly what are called tipping points, are happening much faster than we have anticipated. Our collective action still amounts to denial. We are not yet acting on a daily basis as if we are facing an urgent, life-threatening emergency. So we need to transform, not incrementally approve a few things, invest in renewables now that they're profitable, but dramatically and radically change things. The EU's current commitment, global commitments generally, are to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2030. That is estimated by the IPCC to give us a 2/3 chance of survival. Would you hop on a plane if you were told you had a 2/3 chance of getting to your destination alive? You would probably ask for something to be done to give a higher probability of safety, and that's what this chart is all about. Our global commitments are important and they represent great strides forward, but they are still inadequate given the risks we face. We need net zero on carbon emissions globally as soon as possible, ideally by 2030, if we are to avoid breaching the 2-degree limit. And that is a massive undertaking. It's far greater than anything that is currently being contemplated officially. It gives us roughly a decade in which to implement the greatest transformation in human history. Just to put things in context, as Laura mentioned, global emissions reduced unexpectedly last year as a result of COVID by about 6 to 7% overall. For us to get to net zero by 2030 globally, we would have to commit to 2020 scale change every year for the next 10 years at least. And look at what we managed to mobilize. Look at how we have mobilized to tackle COVID, from legislation to collective action on solutions finding, small acts of solidarity everywhere, and massive amounts of public money for recovery. Just imagine what we could achieve if we approached climate change with the same concentrated recognition of a need to act. So that leads me to this evening. We are learning a lot from COVID, not least and probably most importantly, what the words complex and systemic mean, and how importantly the capability for collective action in the face of danger is. We know that we have a number of things we really need to do, and we're able to translate them now into concrete actions. And we have some change afoot. We have a Biden administration in power determined to make a difference. We have Antonio Guterres stepping up the call for global action with COP26 this year, and the EU moving already on the primacy of climate change and climate action. So there is a context for change. And where does that leave finance? Finance, from my perspective, is one of, if not the most powerful levers for change we have. It is the key to radical transitions, as the IPCC described them. It is the key to unlocking transformative opportunities on local and global scales to deal with those transitions. And it's not by chance that one of Biden's first acts has been to a call for a summit in April to launch a plan with a federal investment of $1.7 trillion over the next 10 years in climate and environment, leveraging private sector, state and local investments to total more than $5 trillion. Because what we spend our money on is what we will get. So against this backdrop, I'd like to touch on 3 points that I'm going to frame as questions. What is finance currently doing about climate change? Is that enough? How might finance help us accelerate towards the kind of world and society and economy we need? And what are the opportunities for Ireland? Let me start with what finance is currently doing. There has been substantial focus internationally on climate risks, both in terms of risk to investment, physical risk from catastrophic events, loss, cost of repair and so on, and transition risks, the costs associated with changing regulation requiring different business models, carbon prices, and business models that are necessary to achieve the Paris goals, and ultimately stranded assets. We know, for example, 2020 was the second warmest year on record. Natural disasters produced losses of $210 billion, of which only 82 billion was insured. And this is very much a sign of the times. Climate change is beginning to make this kind of risk uninsurable. The question of stranded assets is coming increasingly to the fore with a dawning realization of systemic risk. For example, in food, multiple breadbasket failure, staple crops collapsing, food systems collapse, sea level rise, triggering a flooding of cities with huge populations, refugee flight, large-scale destabilization, making cities, for example, likely to be amongst the most significant stranded assets. On the other side of things, disclosure and reporting, substantial work is being done on disclosing to make more transparent to the market and to everyday investors the risks that firms are taking and their profile of emissions. For example, the TCFD is one of the leading examples of a huge push to ensure that companies have a risk management framework for dealing with climate risks and are being transparent about their situation. And there has been a huge push on ensuring, as part of the context of COVID, to really drive home exposing the fragility of our globalized system to systemic risk that is affecting manufacturing, trade, supply chains, food, health, and finance. Reporting and disclosure have opened up markets bit by bit for investment in sustainable or green solutions. Much work is being done to direct finance to green solutions, principally through secondary markets, so bonds on the debt side or sustainable assets on the equity side. And Climate-KIC itself, we have been supporting a significant portfolio of innovation in the field of disclosure and guidelines for investors, helping both retail as well as institutional asset managers and asset owners where to go and what to do. I'll just give you an example of six of a much bigger portfolio, including in Ireland itself, some of the work of really directing financial flows towards the solutions map in both decarbonisation and adaptation. Institutionally, the European Union has made a very, very good start with the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy that we have been participating in, helping create a classification for what is an environmentally sustainable asset. And this becomes extremely complex as you start to unpack it, because, of course, as we know, one thing begins to connect to another thing, one thing leads to another thing, and it's very, very hard to draw the boundaries between where and how to define responsibility. But this kind of a framework helps feed into public procurement as a key lever for change, the so-called demand finance. And if I just give you a sense of why does that matter, the minute that 100 European cities start insisting that they will only build buildings with green cement, with green steel, with green glass, with green gyprock, and with climate resilient surfacing materials, all of a sudden markets start to shift and business models start to grow and investment starts to come. But the question is it enough? And my answer would be no. We are running out of time. And market forces are still tethered to safety, to comfort. They are still looking for reliability, predictability, consistency, and therefore linear incremental change, which is not helpful because what we're facing is non-linear disruption, exactly as we are experiencing with COVID, but over and over again. So we need to do something different, and we need finance to do something different. On risk and disclosure, we need real degrees of warming to empower fully informed consumers who are able to vote with our feet. I need to know exactly where every single cent that I spend on the high street, save in my bank, is actually going. Real data, not data that confirms existing biases and interest, and open data. And here I would draw attention, for example, to Icebreaker 1, which is one of the initiatives, again, we're proud to support it, that is really working to identify and build the data infrastructure that is needed to address climate change that is open, interoperable. It's a standards-based marketplace for environmental and financial data so that interdependencies can be understood, spillover effects, and encourage a much, much more liquid market for financial innovation in sustainability. On the risk and modelling side, something like Oasis Hub is doing something very similar, an open source platform for models that help us understand how climate change is going to affect our world and use innovative forms of insurance, parametrics, and so on to manage that risk better and encourage transformation in business models towards financing resilience and adaptation, and by extension, also mitigation. But the overall percentage of financial flows and investments globally in anything sustainable is still a tiny, tiny fraction of the whole financial market, the whole economic market. And the most sustainable finance is still focused on secondary market instruments rather than on innovating the way finance engages with the real economy. So effectively, the financial system, the system of both equity and debt, is still propping up high emissions industries, high emission living, and vested interests that are dominating decision making. To make this real, if you are negotiating with your employer about your pension, or you're talking to your broker about a pension, and you ask the question, how many degrees of global warming is my pension contributing to? The answer, if they know, will be 3 to 6 degrees of global warming, which is uninhabitable for humans and most other species. That's because pension funds, for example, have been very slow to wake up to the risk and to a fiduciary duty in this regard. if you like, to invest in sustainability in the broader sense and divest from traditional sources of return, where those sources still have cross-holdings in fossil fuels or in high emissions businesses. Same goes for the shareholding and investment structure of high street banks, most insurers and premium stock corporates. So just to give you some statistics, pension funds have US 28 trillion of US dollars in assets, and of that, asset allocation to green investments is less than 1%. 15 OECD pension funds manage at least 79 billion in fossil fuel assets. And they do so for exactly the reasons I outlined before: predictability, reliability, some sense of market security in terms of profit. So as I said, the stocks and flows of capital, what finance pays for, will ultimately determine what we live with, whether we're protecting or perpetuating the multiple sources of greenhouse gas emissions or moving the needle towards transformative change. And at this point, it's not just a question of volume. It really comes down to how we mobilize capital in service of our goals to transform economic sectors and the places in which we live. On that, there has been a lot less focus. And this is where companies really need capital allocation frameworks that are materially different, that are innovative. We are usually told, for example, working in financial innovation, that the problem is ostensibly lack of investable opportunities, too few sustainable projects to meet the growing demand or to match the scale of financial flows in the world. I want to put an argument to you here that says it's not that investment opportunities are too few. There are now actually multiple opportunities for financial investment, but they do not fit current return assumptions and investment structures and habits. They don't look like investable assets when they're considered in the lens of current market norms. And I'm going to kind of walk through what the alternative is. It is about divestment. It is about a massive redirection of investment, but it is also about a redesign of investment thinking and definitions of value. And here I would love to refer back to Mark Carney's Reith lecture at the end of last year. This is value driven by values for if you like, market forces for good. Here, the structures and the flows of private finance are critical, as well as public finance. And let me explain what that means. And I'm going to explain this on our own skin as an organization working right in the thick of climate action, climate innovation, working in the financial system. We are an innovation agency that's worked for 10 years on climate solutions. And what we've learned from our own experience is that investment agendas and project finance typically seek discrete investable projects, something that you can put your arms around, you can describe, I paid for that and I got this, with associated financial return. And the expectations as a result tend to produce or look for or privilege single point solutions, single projects, single assets, single technologies or information solutions. And that in turn often results in disconnected projects that are contained within traditional resource planning or within, they're run by different decision-making silos or sectors. That gives us incremental change. So we decided in 2019 to do something different and to launch something structurally different, to use the unique public-private position of Climate-KIC to prototype something very different. We launched what we call deep demonstrations, which are a way of responding to one of the biggest problems we faced, which is a seeing is believing problem. What does a whole city look like if it's fully decarbonized? What do whole agricultural regions look like if they're completely net zero? What this approach does is to shift from single solutions that tend to be funneled through innovation models, trying to work out which one is the best, the most investable, the winning solution, likely to be a market leader, and takes a step back and says, let's start instead with the problem. We know that we need to change whole cities and whole agricultural regions. We're going to need to intervene on every single aspect of the way those cities or those regions work. And we're going to need to start by, for example, the problem, the demand-led question. And that will be, what is it that a city, Dublin, or an agricultural area, the Irish, or an area with a lot of social and industrial change to make, the Irish Midlands, what would actually need to change? And to define that as a problem space. And then start to assume that we simply don't know how to achieve that scale of change in the short amount of time we have. And our best bet would be to invest in multiple parallel solutions, testing all sorts of different approaches at every single intervention point we could find. and to do so simultaneously, connected up in such a way as to learn from them, so that we really begin to harness the power of innovation to help us understand and de-risk, if you like, get used to, look at and learn from what does it like to connect waste, changes in waste management, changes in the way we live and produce food or consume food or throw away plastics, changes in the way we move about, changes in the way in which we think about our relationship with the natural environment in cities and so on. And that's what gives us a portfolio approach. It means we are really looking to leverage points within individual constructs. If you're thinking in terms of a city, it means that we're innovating simultaneously within one context in a specific place with innovation actions on every single one of those elements of what makes up urban life and urban transformation. And so that gives us a very, very diverse, different kind of way of thinking about innovation that accelerates as fast as possible the pace of change. What it gives us from the perspective of a financial view is portfolios. This is one of the cities in Europe where we're working. This is Madrid. This is a whole portfolio of innovation initiatives, each one of which is intervening in a different aspect. There's a gender and equality perspective on mobility. There are nature-based solutions, trees as infrastructure. There's interventions on air quality, waste management, retrofit of buildings, the redesign of social housing, solutions to support transition in areas that are based on high emissions industries and need to change jobs and reskill. And when you start to drill down to it, this is just one example within natural solutions. How does the city start to privilege rewilding and use much, much denser trees, organic materials to change heat, lower heat, capture water, create much better air quality, improve emotional and mental well-being, community structures, community spaces, and even getting to the point of de-risking the fragility of food systems, because these can be community gardens and so on. So it begins to become a particularly interesting environment, a very rich environment for transformation. And that leads us to the question of how to sustain it with capital. How do we bring capital alongside this kind of transformative approach to innovation in a way that is similarly systemic? The innovation portfolios that emerge from this work create compelling investment opportunities, both in the form of single investable assets, for example, startups or projects that are at this point scaling into 20 European cities, but also in the form of strategic investment portfolios, if you like, that span multiple asset classes. And I don't mean by this the classic financial portfolio where you put a spread of bets on a whole lot of different financial investment categories or asset classes, but a place-based, a real portfolio in a physical space of a city, or the physical space of an agricultural area, or the physical space or virtual space of a global value chain. And these are designed, these portfolios, to be connected and to transform specific systems where the uncertainty of innovation solutions that normally makes it hard for investors to have the courage to put kind of big commitments is de-risked by the fact that they are located within markets. They are being tested within markets in the form of large and larger scale proof of concept. So what we've done is to start working on shifting the focus of financial investment from single investable assets to portfolio level investments in places, in primary marketplaces, for example, cities as an asset class, the transformation of whole cities or whole agricultural areas as an asset class, and to think about how can we rethink and redesign investment so that it is possible to direct large capital flows to change whole places or economic sectors rather than investing project by project, and to do so with a combination of investment interests and a fiduciary logic, a combination of strategic risk management, risk reduction, stewardship. I can come back to this question of how pension funds engage. We call this transformational capital. It also helps us in turn to avoid the oversupply of capital to too few green designated assets, which then risks causing a big bubble because you've got too much money and too few things to invest in it. And in addition to working in this space, working on what we call deep demonstrations with city governments or with regional governments or national governments, one of the ways in which we're also exploring how to support this transformation in finance is to work, for example, with the Climate Financial Risk Forum, co-chaired by the Bank of England, the Prudential Regulation Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority, where we're coordinating the innovation working group of the CRF and focusing innovation thinking on how do we mobilize capital rather than how do we manage financial risks. And that is looking at innovation to link pools of existing capital with need, to overcome practical challenges for industry, for example, the mechanisms to support capital allocation to transition-based assets, not just green bubbles, and to improve data and metrics. However, the design and practice of the financial system is also a root cause behind climate change acceleration and behind the resistance to any form of structural change. I have referred several times to the notion of transformation. When it comes to climate change, the primary focus of transformation needs to be us, ourselves. Specifically, we need to transform our paradigm for life and for human society, because ultimately the issue is whether our current design for life is feasible and whether this is how a population of 7 billion or more can live. And in many ways, that comes down to changing our assumption that we can continue to aspire to growth and prosperity in material terms, to consume, to design for obsolescence, to waste, rather than contemplate and act on the alternative, something closer to what is currently called degrowth. And to change that, we need to address three critical features, design features of the financial system. First of all, the financial system is designed to do business with itself and to perpetuate that. And I've put up John Kay's marvelous and thoroughly depressing analysis of that, entitled Other People's Money, looking at and digging deep into the financial crisis. It has really lost sight of ordinary people's needs and concerns. It is focused on short-term horizons and optimized for short-term gain. And that includes core institutional mechanisms like discounted cash flow, cost-benefit analysis, accounting practices that systematically discount the future in favor of the present. And ultimately, our financial system continues to promote consumption as the basis for growth. Commercial growth is the key to prosperity and well-being. Therefore, we continue to promote neoclassical economics and neoliberal politics. Now, having said all of that and launched a series of provocations at the financial system, what are the opportunities for Ireland? Much of the focus of Irish strategy has been about increasing the quantity of financial services done in and through Ireland. Putting Ireland and enlarging Ireland on the map as a centre for global finance and for sustainable finance specifically. But given the sustainability agenda, given the situation we're in, and I think actually in a current context, to continue to take a leadership position, Ireland needs to focus on the quality, not just the quantity of international financial services it supports. It has made an excellent start with green bonds, but here there are opportunities through services like this is one of the startups that comes through the Trinity Accelerator. And this indeed is the Trinity context, the Tangent initiative. There are enormous opportunities to expand and deepen the range and the breadth and the quality of solutions that are financed in Ireland and made in Ireland. And that does include extensive education and learning opportunities across the financial sector and reskilling in almost all areas of the economy. Secondly, I think there's an opportunity for lighthouse projects to show others how it could be done. This is currently where we are operating with this systemic systems innovation logic and looking at how do we pull in capital. And you'll see Ireland is included there actually with one of the most extraordinary projects called long-termism on redesigning the financial system's relationship with short-term thinking towards a longer-term perspective. But in Ireland at the moment, there are some extraordinary opportunities, first of which would be transforming cities and towns to net zero, to move to a 10 to 15 year investment mindset with multiple spillovers or co-benefits from improved housing, public spaces, mobility, public health benefits, jobs, and local supply chains. There are opportunities here with this project to transform Ireland's huge agri-food sector, land, landscapes, land use, agriculture, and food, to face into the changes in Brexit, to dynamic market changes, and the need to retain a thriving economic sector. And I would highlight here that Circulaire, we are one of the initiatives that we are co-funding and hosting with the Institute of Manufacturing Research in partnership with the EPA and the Irish government for the National Platform of Circular Economy in Ireland. This is one of the initiatives that is really applying in real terms systems innovation principles, and principles that will open up enormous investment opportunities as part of circular economy and circularity in the Irish industry. And this is an example of what that might look like in terms of impact. There are enormously rich possibilities here of extending, let me just bring that down, of extending portfolios of interventions at local, at regional, and at national level to test change and to rapidly scale up climate-proofed agri-food initiatives and bioeconomy initiatives, biorefining, as well as accessing new financial models and large-scale skills and learnings programs. But let me up the ante just a little and leave you with an invitation that is something of an enthusiastic provocation. Ireland's emissions are not where they need to be. And my question to the financial sector is, what is the financial sector in Ireland doing to dramatically lower them? Targets and taxes are not going to be sufficient. You will need to be bold, to design and to act to achieve radical transitions. In the international context, Europe's prioritization of climate, 750 billion COVID recovery with 35% to be invested in climate, this is an opportunity to seize the day and take a leadership role as the global focus on post-recovery and COP26 take a hold. If Ireland is to be a role model in sustainable finance, then I would argue that her leadership needs to reach much deeper into the core assumptions and structures and design of the financial system, its institutions, its norms, the dark art or dark heart of core finance, if you like, what one of our partners calls the dark matter that is embedded in all sorts of policies and rules and small regulations and big regulations and habits and practices that shape our lives, ways of thinking and being that are almost beyond our consciousness. In this context, Ireland could offer a demonstration of what is possible by operationalizing new economic models, something like the Beyond GDP initiative that is really looking at coming up with alternatives to our current neoclassical economic mechanisms, and to do so through new business models for housing, for retrofit, for circular economy, which will challenge almost all of the linear mechanics that we have currently been using. Sandboxes for regulatory experimentation with sustainable finance. This is a time-honored tradition in fintech, but there's a huge opportunity here to extend that into sustainable initiatives. And for example, think about securitization of the future value of land, of businesses, of agriculture that have been sustainably managed, that are sustainably managed, acting as carbon sinks, not only producing nature-based solutions, but regenerating the planet, securitizing the future value of them, of the buildings that are sustainable, and beginning to release that into the economy. And finally, an opportunity in a European context that is rather extraordinary. The new European Bauhaus has been launched by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, as an opportunity to do something uniquely European, to bring together a passion for living well, for living in style, for appreciating the aesthetics of life, and for placing distinctive cultural stamps on those aesthetics, together with the sustainability agenda and with the agenda for just transformations, the horrible injustice of climate, and how we will bring that together with a deliberate inclusiveness in the way we operate. And I think Ireland here has an extraordinary opportunity to step forward as one of the 5 candidates to focus on regenerative actions, technologies, new skills, and the reintegration of art and science here in this extraordinary culture that has created so much influence in the world in the past and has the opportunity to do so again in the future. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Kirsten, for such a provocative and all-encompassing presentation. And it only leaves us with just the difficulty of knowing which threads of your argument are the ones that we should pick up on. But you mentioned there Ireland's opportunity, and among the questions that have come in for you is, if you were head of the Irish Central Bank for one day tomorrow, what key policy changes? Now, this, of course, presumes that the Irish Central Bank director is even more influential than he or she is, in fact. But if you were a dictator, as it were, and head of the central bank for one day tomorrow, what key policy would you unlock in the Irish case?
I think I would initiate the means by which the Irish Central Bank starts to look into or support and sustain mechanisms and platforms for systemic investing. I think one of the biggest limitations we have is that we are looking for individual things instead of directing capital at whole-scale change. And it's very hard because we don't have the tools and the frameworks and the platforms to do it. And one of the most valuable things that could possibly happen is the combination of standards, of platforms, of examples, of the rails, literally, to direct finance at whole city transformation, for example, or whole agricultural area transformation.
And people, let me ask you about the Madrid issue as a case history. Is that Spanish money, or is it even Madrid money that will be brought in to change Madrid?
It's a combination. It's the Spanish government has actually put forward the Madrid project into the COVID recovery package as one of the propositions that they put forward in the early draft. So it would be a combination of European money, a combination of national money, a combination of local money, and there are a number of industries involved. So also industries, in some cases, these are industries like Ferrovial or Iberdrola. They are international companies with local stakes who are investing, and included in the initiative is the idea of crowdfunding, also that individual citizens are able to invest their own cent in a sense of how the city transforms. And it's a very interesting case. The Madrid case, just the early initiatives suggest that about 70,000 jobs can be created just by the combination of initiatives that the city is seeking to do. The big change is that the city is doing them as one connected whole, instead as a set of kind of individually disparate and divided projects that individuals go off and do on their own.
And insofar as so much of your ambition is to bring people into your agenda and play the new game on the rules that you're suggesting would be greener and would be more efficacious. People do love place. I mean, people in any city in the world, they will tell you very quickly where they're from. It's almost the second question you ask them. And they're proud of it, and they cheer for that football team. It matters to them. And the air quality obviously matters to them and to their children. So in getting people on board, the city's initiative is hugely important and has great potential.
And as indeed also for rural communities. I think that's absolutely
Place,
true.
in other
It's
words.
one of the
Love of
things
place. Yeah.
It's one of the things we've seen in COVID. I described it as small acts of solidarity, people literally reaching out in really local areas to be able to reform a sense of community. And acting there is really one of the most critical. It's the only way we can, thread by thread, build a sense of ownership and co-design for a different way of living. And I think that's actually why I find the New European Bauhaus a particularly hope-inspiring initiative, because it's effectively asking for exactly that we acknowledge the power of loving the places we live and of being proud of coming from them and of bringing the emotion and the care back into the question of how we change ourselves.
And the Bauhaus was one of Europe's great intellectual achievements and changed the world that we live in. Many people are living with its consequences without even knowing what the original movement was about. Indeed. So it's a very good example and a happily chosen word. Can I say that your own title is hard to EIT Climate-KIC. It's quite hard to go into a room or a dinner party and people say, well, what do you work for? And I'll tell you, most of them wouldn't know, would they?
No. This is indeed not one of our strengths. We certainly need a.
So what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? How are you going to vulgarize the agenda? In other words.
Well, in our particular case, we're a catalyst, and the strength of what we do is our partners. It's the organizations we work with. So in Ireland, it's Trinity, it's Sustainable Finance Ireland. It's the organizations that are close to the ground, that know their people, that know what needs to be done, and that's actually our core strength. So much of what we are seeking to do is create the frameworks and the conditions for those organizations to do what they know how to do, and to make sure that they're able to join forces with one another, to learn from one another, and to kind of pool collective intelligence as they do so. So very often, actually, it's not necessarily our brand that matters so much as the brand of those who are on the ground really making the change happen.
And among our other questions then, people are asking, what are the roles of the EU government, investment banks and central banks?
Well, and I was just thinking in the back of my mind about your first question about the Irish Central Bank. I think probably actually the most important thing, like tomorrow, and if I were in any one of them tomorrow, it would be to stop subsidies to fossil fuels. That is actually I mean, it's almost, it almost burns me to say that we would even have to do that it's still there. But yes, I think so. Let's start with the most urgent and kind of unfortunately urgent. Stop the flow of funds to fossil fuels and to anything propping them up, because that's just killing ourselves. And the next thing is markets need some sense of certainty. They need a sense of predictability. The quicker we create policy frameworks and fairly consistent signals to enable a sense of, I might not like this new world, I might not like that I have to completely redesign my business model, but if I know it's going to be like that for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I'll get on and do it. The killer is just not quite knowing, will it come? If it will come, how bad will it come? When will it come? When do I have to make a shift? And I think the combined power of the financial industry, and particularly the institutional banks, and saying this is happening, it needs to happen now. You've still got capital in play, use it and transform.
And we've lost one bank. It was actually a Scottish-owned multinational that was driving the particular bank, the Ulster Bank. When an economy loses a bank like that, and that's a bit of a shock to quite a few of the people who are associated, employees, of course, as well. But is that a moment of opportunity and to refocus and to rethink some things? Do you think? I mean, are the conventional banks we have the right model anyway?
Well, I think one of the things that this is why I would thoroughly recommend reading John Kay's Other People's Money. I think one of the points of reflection we have to really think about is, what are they ultimately in service of? And if the answer is not people on the street earning money, doing a job, trying to work through their lives and wanting to direct their lives with a sense of longevity for their children or for their relations and friends, then there's something wrong. So there are indeed now there begin to be multiple other alternatives, ways of thinking about whether it's leveraging distributed ledger to create much more participatory mechanisms for the flow of funds, or for storing or for reserving, beginning to literally replace the need for a bricks and mortar institution that says safety and security. And I think that will come more and more. My impression is it's a race against time of who transforms faster. The institutions change quick enough to lead change, or they're left behind, and other forms of transferring wealth, of saving, and of taking care of risk spring up and do the job for them.
I was very struck by your opening graphic there, the cartoon showing wash your hands because of COVID, but the bigger issue coming behind. And of course, COVID has given the entire world a fright. Proportionately and correctly, it has done that. But there's a positive in that too, isn't there? That the scale is an indication of the sort of change we need and the threat.
Indeed. And for someone in my job, it's actually been one of the helpful things. It's been thoroughly, incredibly difficult to deal with, because I'm trying to work with city governments or regional governments or national governments through the computer, and that's just not easy. And of course, it's life-threatening. But it has finally brought real everyday meaning to what connected systems are. The fact that you can't go to your supermarket, or you couldn't go to your supermarket immediately and get anything that you wanted, the sense of crisis, the realization that if you order a thing now, it's not necessarily going to show up, the chaos and the muddle of our over-fragile supply chains, we have finally kind of understood, that's what connected systems look like. And if, this is one thing, you start adding up 2 or 3 of those kinds of things, it really finally begins to sink in what crisis looks like and how hard it is for us to mobilize fast to solve a crisis of that order. And on the other hand, the fact that nonetheless we can. So it really has a fascinating kind of double side. It's taught us a few lessons, and it's shown us that change is possible. Dramatic change really is possible.
And likewise, and it's not always the most popular industry when it comes to these matters, but the pharmaceutical industry has also shown how science can actually come up so quickly and on a global scale with vaccines. That's also an achievement.
It is, and I think it's one of the things I would particularly reflect upon is and with a different logic with respect to the normal competitive dynamics, with a logic of open, interoperable, collaborative. And I think that is really one of the keys. We're going to need radical collaborations across the world in all sorts of ways, whether it's because, particular staple crops fail and we suddenly need to find where to get food sources, or whether it's because we need the best of our intelligence in different solutions applied across the world. We really need that. So anything that helps us learn to start to trust working with one another helps.
So that's one plus for COVID anyway.
It is.
I can see you using it as a COVID metaphor. Well, another question that's coming in, you've talked about investors trying to fund projects and the individual and SMEs particularly. Where do they find money for energy efficiency or renewable energy?
Investors or SMEs?
Well, both. I mean, the smaller players, if you like, and including the individual investor.
Well, I think that depends very much on. So there are. If the question is where do they find money or where do they find the sources, there is a range of interesting solutions now for how to collectivize interest in renewable energy and collectivize investment in it. There are funds. I put my pension in a fund that is deliberately is entirely green and is deliberately directing then the proceeds of that into enabling small participatory groups in neighborhoods and communities, for example, to source funding for community projects. Some of the European Union's SME projects, the ASME projects, but also actually the new European Innovation Council has an entire program dedicated to SMEs looking for financing, and partly financing also to look at how they diversify and stretch into green energy and green energy solutions. So I think it's in part partnering with financial institutions that understand the need, and that's probably where one of the really big opportunities for banks, for example, are. How are they going to offer loans that are helping and supporting investment or drawing down on funds to make changes in energy supply that are virtuous? It's partly ways in which you can use insurance mechanisms to drive subsidies or drive reliefs and benefits towards investment. It's partly about individual funds and funds that are starting to create some pools of liquidity, and it's partly about participatory ownership. A lot of the renewable, in many cases, renewables are actually within a prosumer reach. It is possible for individual consumers to actually produce and sell to one another.
And ethical investments now have been with us for some time, certainly with us the last 40 or 50 years, say on the tobacco industry, sometimes on alcohol. But tobacco as an entirely useless product has been targeted by many people as something they don't want their pension fund in. Are you saying that there could be, as it were, a pressure from the consumer, from the individual, to force the pace of change in this sector?
I'm saying there really must be. Speaking as a mother and speaking as somebody whose day job brings me very close to the nature of this risk, there must be. If every single one of us literally walked in and said, I will only buy this, give it to me, you got 200,000, 500,000, 1 million people asking for that, there's a market. There's a wonderful story of 250,000 consumers writing a letter to Volkswagen manufacturing in China saying, we all want a car and we all want this car and this is what we're willing to pay for it. And not surprisingly, they made it. That's a big market signal. So I think that's exactly what we do need to do. Yeah.
Another question here is, do smaller financial institutions such as credit unions have the size and wealth contribution meaningful to these models?
Well, again, it depends. As long as the models are perceived as being marginal, then it becomes different, as it becomes difficult. But as soon as you start to encourage the mechanisms that make them more and more mainstream, not necessarily. Plus, the cost of many of the solutions is now at a point where it's equal to or below the cost of apparently immediately consumer-friendly high-emission solutions. So I think it's not necessarily a question of institutions that are not in the right class to be able to afford this. It's really a question of exercising choice and looking at where the sources are.
You mentioned investment in agricultural areas and regions. Would you be able to give us some examples of the sort of innovations that are supporting or including as part of the capital schemes? Carl Richards had that question. Yeah.
So, yes. So, for example, the question around land use and forestry, and then, for example, the relationship between forestry and one of the core initiatives in the new European Bauhaus is wood in construction. So ways in which reuse or mixed use landscapes can be used to combine a much greater density of trees and therefore greater degree of carbon sinks, harvesting or forestering of trees to then be used both through low-end and high-end technology solutions for construction, low-end in direct construction, high-end in terms of things like nanocrystallization of lignin, where you take a substrate of wood and you can make it as flexible and hard as steel. So there's a range of possibilities where the landscape use can be designed to have some part of it as a carbon sink, some part of it as a carbon offset, and some part of it flowing into activities that are then capturing carbon through other forms, mixed in with agricultural design. There are other initiatives that are about the resilience of agricultural systems in terms of technologies around water capture, water distribution, or heat resilience. There's a combination then in terms of agricultural practices on seed or planting, kind of farming and planting practices, climate smart agriculture that really looks or is combining artificial intelligence and data algorithms to work out exactly what to plant where and exactly how much humidity and moisture is needed to optimize production and how to think about carbon capture within the soil. And then there's kind of even bigger plays around using some of our most advanced technologies like a multi-agent technology that is looking at how do you optimize the entire agricultural production supply system to capture carbon at every point or to minimize carbon emissions. So it's everything from changing really small things about agricultural practices to redesigning large-scale production and thinking about and redesigning the relationship between what we use land for, where we tend to use it for a particular thing, and thinking about how do we use it for multiple things simultaneously, including carbon capture and carbon storage.
But many people making the decisions about the land have been there. They got the acres from, and this will be a reference you won't need to know, but to keep a firm grip on their holdings, they got the acres 150 years ago. And they've had them since in the same family sometimes. Now, they're a pretty conservative, with a small c, group of people. They don't go for change that quickly. They don't embrace it.
They also hold a lot of knowledge, deep, long knowledge. Yeah. And I think here's an opportunity to combine the values of deep, long knowledge and long-term thinking with the opportunities to educate and use technology, use the advantages of technology, or use, if you like, the impulse of curiosity to think about what could a long view with a care for stewardship of land and stewardship of ownership of land or curation of land, what could that bring to the opportunities here to create sustainable farming? Because there are extraordinary opportunities and they come with both attractiveness for investors to begin to partner or to provide support, but they also come with significant attractiveness in terms of regenerating biodiversity, which in turn regenerates productivity and the quality of soils and so on. So I wonder whether the conservatism that seems to possibly be resistance to change could in fact be the greatest virtue that farming and landowners can bring to the climate problem, which is the conservatism of care and curation for land and for forests and for environment that could be leveraged much more strongly. The challenge is, of course, decoupling it from the market forces that have driven us to really try to privilege short-term, fast, extractive, high-volume yields and really kind of take a step back and take a long view.
We've had a number of questions, by the way. I don't know whether you're free to say this or not. We want to know the name of your own pension company.
Now that it's called, let me just find that, it's called Future Super, but it's in Australia.
It's in Australia. So is it open to international markets or otherwise?
Possibly, yeah, possibly.
Well,
and if not, The founder of it is a man called Simon Sheikh. I'm sure he would be interested in suggesting what other alternatives there are.
So, and as a case history of such a green pension fund, is it written about and is it the subject of anything that's accessible? I'm sure it is on the web.
That's a
we
very
can put
good,
that up on our
as
website,
a case history, I don't know. I will look that up myself.
Yeah, and if you give it to us, we'll put it up. We'll attach it to the end of this, the
Good
webcast
idea.
on this particular case. I shouldn't expect you to necessarily know. So that's one of the problems, isn't it? That so many people don't know the detail of their own finances because they think that's for it's decision they take and they don't switch and change in the market. They as individuals, they're quite conservative about that part of their lives, even though it can be so important.
Indeed.
Yeah. And in general, then, are you optimistic at all? I mean, some people think that you're asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. That essentially the people who run the economic system that we have at the moment are themselves your unlikeliest supporters.
Well, when you ask me that question, the reflection that comes immediately, or at least the echo that comes immediately to mind, is Antonio Gramsci referring to being a pessimist by force of reason, but an optimist by force of will. I am a mother of 2 children. I work on a daily basis with small companies, with entrepreneurs, with students, with large industry, with boards of directors in larger industry. And what I observe across the board is a sense of determination. There's life in us yet, and we simply cannot afford to assume that pessimism or how would I describe it, or diffidence or even just giving up is an option. So I think, yes, I am an optimist. I'm an optimist with a bit of a dark heart. I think that crisis will come. And it will, as it is, and it will begin finally to force us into action too late compared to what we could have achieved if we'd started earlier. But I'm also someone who've worked for years in insurance and watched and seen the quality of intellect and thinking that goes on behind the scenes. I think there's a very big difference between what sits at the facade of institutions and what goes on behind the scenes. For me, the critical difference is what I have learned to call social and behavioral tipping points for change. The points at which a sufficient accumulation of people, not necessarily taking extremely kind of radicalized or apparently radicalized positions, but a sufficient combination of ordinary everyday people pushing for and asking for change actually tips over a system. And we know before COVID, we watched that happen with Greta Thunberg and Fridays for the Future. We watched people, I sat in a room with the G20 watching the CEOs of the major car companies in the world finally having a conversation about the fact that it was time to change. I think we're really close to that. And it now is that those last few inches and degrees and centimeters that require us to keep asking for something different, to keep educating ourselves on how much we need to ask for, and to keep educating ourselves on possibilities. And we run programs that are about educating students on how to become climate entrepreneurs. In the course of 4 or 5 months, they are inventing extraordinary solutions. So yes, I believe in the power of human change, and I believe in the power of possibility. I think it's a question of how many of us can join forces to make that actually tip over.
Kirsten Dunlop, thank you so much for joining us from the Netherlands this evening. And we're really grateful to you for such a provocative presentation and for taking our questions. And apologies to those who sent us questions that we didn't get to. There are very many more on my screen above there, and we just didn't get to them. But I think they were touched on in the presentation, and that presentation itself will be online. We thank you all for participating, and give us your feedback survey as well. The material will be made available on the EPA Ireland website and the YouTube channel. That's EPA Ireland YouTube channel. Thanks to Dr. Kirsten Dunlop again, and to the EPA